This video is sponsored by Hostinger. Visit hostinger.com/nameexplain and use the code nameexplain to get up to 91% off yearly web hosting plans. The name generation seems to derive from the old French generation, with this word meaning things along the lines of race of people, offspring, and giving birth. This of course all derives from the Proto-Indo-European root of gene, which means give birth/beget, and it's from this root we get all other kinds of words like generate, generator, and of course genes. All these words relate to creating something, whether that be other humans like with genes, or electricity like with generator. However, let's go back to that old French word of generation, which means giving birth/race of people. This is such a good way to get your head around what exactly a generation of people is, as they kind of are like a race of people, but instead of being connected by a similar geography, ancestor, or ethnic group, they are a race of people connected by time, specifically the time they were born. That's my wishy-washy definition of a generation anyway. A much more concise definition comes to us from Collins Dictionary, which defines them as people in a group or country who are of a similar age, especially when they are considered as having the same experiences or attitudes, which should make things a little bit more clear. Though what's interesting to me is that despite the fact we do have a dictionary definition for what a generation is, they can still be quite hard to pin down. In a recent video we talked about Pokemon generations, which are quite easy to pin down as to when they started and ended. With actual human generations, things aren't quite as clear to us. Different sources have different start and end dates for when a generation could be born, and this ideal generation seems to be a very Western concept, specifically in the USA. Though I have read that other nations have their own generations, like in South Africa, those born in 1994 and onwards are sometimes called the born free generation, as they were born after the end of apartheid. Personally, what I find interesting about generations is just how unique each one is. It's not like the same tropes relating to people of a certain age are being repeated every 30 years or so with a fresh coat of paint. Each generation of people experience something unique that won't apply to the generation before or after them. On a personal note, I was born in 1994, which makes me just about a millennial by some definitions, or a Gen Z in other definitions. Whatever the case, when I was young, so was the World Wide Web. As a young child, I remember getting our first home computer, only being allowed to use the internet after 6 PM, and of course that wonderful dial-up sound. It feels very much like I grew up as the internet grew. Now compare that to say my parents, who all of a sudden in adulthood had this thing thrust upon them, or say young children of today, who grew up never experiencing for themselves a life without the internet. That birth of the internet is a time only myself and others of similar age around me grew up with, and no other generation will experience exactly that. This might just seem like a personal ramble, but it's a great example of how different being a certain age can be at a certain time in history. Being 25 in 2019 and being 25 in 1929 are two very different experiences, in turn creating two very different kinds of people. The current stereotype of an old person may not exist in 50 years time, as that generation of old people will no longer exist. Like I said, these generations create very different kinds of people with different ideas about how things should be. Basically, I'm trying to explain this without using the P word and getting everyone angry, and it seems that this divide in generations has become way bigger in recent years. You can often see young people blaming the older generation for the state of the world, and this can be seen the other way around too, of course. However, it must be remembered that these stereotypical ideas that everyone from one generation thinks the same thing simply isn't true. There are people from older generations that have the ideas that are more in line with the ideals of the younger generations, and vice versa. I don't want to stoke the fires of the ever-continuing boomer versus millennial saga. I want to look at these generations, look into what kinds of worlds they were born into and grew up in, what age brackets roughly make them up, and most importantly, find out how they got their names. Also, like I said, the years that generations started aren't seriously defined. The years I'm using come from this chart, which will be a link down below, so if you don't agree with any of them, that's fine, as like I said, there are many different ideas for these generational birth dates. Some of these years even overlap just to make things more confusing. Now, humans have been around for quite some time, so having to explain every generation's name might seem like a seriously daunting task. However, despite this, there aren't that many generations. It seems that this concept of giving generations of humans a name only dates back to the turn of the 20th century. Before this, people just kind of existed, I guess. The first named generation seems to be the Lost generation, who were born between 1890 and 1915. This name of Lost generation was coined by the American writer Gertrude Stein in the early 20th century. She called the people born in these years the Lost generation, as many of them were the ones who fought in the First World War. It could be seen as they were called lost simply because a lot of them lost their lives in the war, but I feel this loss relates more to the lost impact they could have had on the planet if that war never happened. Following the Lost generation, we have the Interbellum generation, with people of this generation being born between 1901 and 1913. The name Interbellum comes from Latin and consists of the Latin inter meaning between and bellum meaning war, so the name translates to the between war generation, so that should give you an idea as to what this generation was all about. They were the ones who grew up in between the First and Second World Wars. They would have experienced the Roaring Twenties, Prohibition and the Great Depression for themselves. After the Interbellum generation, we have the Greatest Generation, which is a weird sounding name and could be seen as being somewhat egotistical, but I don't think this is the case. The Greatest Generation didn't dub themselves this, but were dubbed this due to all the hardships they faced and came out the other end. Those who were a part of the Greatest Generation were born between 1910 and 1924, and like the Interbellum generation, they would have grown up during the Great Depression, but would have been younger. Not only this, but in their young adulthood, they would have had to fight in the Second World War, or stand alongside those who did. Life would have been hard for those in this generation, hence why they were dubbed the greatest for surviving this time in history. This name was cemented by author Tom Brokaw and his book dubbed The Greatest Generation, which retold the history of the Great Depression and the Second World War. I have also read that sometimes the Interbellum and Greatest Generation are seen as just one generation called the GI generation, as the army would have played a large role in their life. They would have been teens during the First World War and soldiers in the Second World War, so this GI name relates to a military GI. And a quick side note on GI, despite being an initialism, there isn't one definite thing it stands for. Apparently it was originally stamped on military trash cans and buckets and meant galvanized iron, as that's what these things were made out of. Though with the First World War, the GI letters were seen more often, becoming associated with the US soldiers themselves, and they became known as GIs, meaning GI went on to mean government issue or general issue, as the soldiers were issued to be there by the government, meaning GI could be seen as a backronym. Though funnily enough, there is another way the GI generation name could be explained, as G and I are the first two letters of the aforementioned generations that make up the GI generation, the Greatest and Interbellum generations. Though as amusing as this is, I think it's just a happy accident. Tangent aside, after the Greatest Generation came the Silent Generation, born between 1925 and 1945. These guys would have been young during the Depression and the Second World War, and as young adults they would have to face post-war financial troubles. I've read a few reasons as to why they've been dubbed the Silent Generation. One idea is that it was this generation who quietly got on with working in their lives as it was so hard after the war, and I also read it's because as children they were told to be quiet. The classic children to be seen not heard ideology came with these guys. With the end of the Second World War, it meant that people could somewhat carry on with their lives, not only carry on with their lives but create new lives too, and the years that followed saw a huge surge in childbirths. You could say it was a boom of babies, hence why the next generation are called baby boomers. Baby boomers are seen as being born between 1946 and 1964, and interestingly enough, this seems to be the one generation of people where the years are agreed upon, at least from my research anyway. It seems that since we started naming generations, baby boomers were the first generation to be mostly safe from war and the hardships of generations before them. It wasn't only the babies that boomed however, as this was a time of economic boom too. Because of this, kids of the baby boomer generation could enjoy a quality of life unprecedented to those before them, and some would argue unprecedented to those after them too. Wikipedia has a really great explanation of baby boomers. As a group, baby boomers were wealthier, more active and more physically fit than any preceding generation, and were the first to grow up genuinely expecting the world to improve with time. In more recent times, however, baby boomer has been shortened to just boomer, and it seems that referring to someone as just a boomer isn't only applied to someone born between 46 and 64, but can be used on anyone deemed a boomer, usually by a person younger than themselves. The OK boomer phenomenon / meme is still somewhat new, so perhaps it won't stick around. I said I didn't want to bring up the P word in this video and just want to look into the names, but Vox have a really interesting article about the whole OK boomer thing. I won't cover it here, but it'll be linked down below, go read it. Following the baby boomers came the baby busters, as there was a drop in birth rates in this time. The baby busters were born between 1965 and 1979, however they aren't actually that widely known as the baby busters. The name they are more known by is Generation X. It seems that Generation X was seen as being a rebellious generation. They grew up in the 70s and 80s, had little trust in the establishment and wanted to find their own voice in life. Think of The Breakfast Club and you have a pretty good idea as to what Generation X was all about. X has always been a letter associated with anger, negativity and simply saying no, hence why it was the letter used for this generation, as they were angry and said no to the establishment. It was popularised by author Douglas Copeland in his 1991 book titled Generation X. The names of generations get a little bit more logical here, as following Gen X came Gen Y, named simply because they followed Gen X, and Y follows X in the alphabet. Luckily however, Gen Y have another much more popular and more interesting name, Millennials. Millennials are born between 1980 technology in 1994. Well, my chart says 94, but many other sources point towards 96. The name millennial comes from the fact that many people of this generation grew up at the turn of the millennium. It seems that this name was coined by authors William Strauss and Neil Howe, and from them the name stuck around. Millennials would have had technology and the digital age creep into their lives while at a young age, as I mentioned from my own experience. There's actually quite a lot of crossover between Gen X and millennials. There's actually a name for the generation of people who straddle the line between Gen X and millennials: Xennials. This name is obviously just a combination of Gen X and millennial, and I read that these Xennials had an analog childhood and a digital adulthood. And of course, following Gen X and Gen Y, we got Gen Z. These are people born roughly between 1995 and 2012, so still very young. These guys are defined as being born fully in the digital age and would have very little idea of life without the internet, smartphones and digital technologies. Gen Z are so synonymous with technology, they're also known as the iGen, relating to the powerhouse that Apple became in this time with their iProducts many Gen Zers use. They're also known as digital natives, as it's all most of them have known, giving the fun name of digital migrants to the other generations that have come before them. Finally, we have Generation Alpha, those born between 2013 and up until today. This name was given to them by Australian researcher Mark McCrindle in his book The ABC of XYZ, Understanding the Global Generations. This is the first generation to be born completely in the 21st century, and this name was given to these children as McCrindle theorized they'll grow up in a period of rebirth and rediscovery, somewhat starting the planet anew. While Alpha was the first letter of the Greek alphabet, today Alpha is a name applied to something new, an alpha test in computing terms. This Alpha generation will hopefully create a new, exciting, better world for us, and the generations that will follow them. As I said, the stereotypes that come with these generations aren't always true. In example, as a millennial, it would be expected that I would know how to use technology and make a website. Well, unfortunately, I'm basically clueless on subjects like this. Luckily for the technophobe millennial like myself, we have Hostinger, who have very kindly sponsored today's video. If you run a business or want to express yourself online without the restrictions other account-based sites like Instagram and YouTube place on you, Hostinger can really help out. They offer quick and reliable web hosting with deals for almost anyone, and are even recommended by CNET. Hostinger is the most affordable web hosting option in the industry. Their hosting is fully optimized for WordPress and built for making the fastest web pages, eShops and all other online projects quickly. They can cover anything you may want, from simple websites for personal use, sites to run your business from, and even personal gaming servers. If you do find yourself confused, however, their award-winning 24/7 dedicated support team will be there to help. NameExplain viewers can visit hostinger.com/nameexplain, link in the description, and use the code NameExplain to get up to 91% off yearly web hosting plans. So why not succeed faster online today? Once again, that's hostinger.com/nameexplain and code NameExplain to get up to 91% off yearly web hosting plans. Thank you to Hostinger for sponsoring today's video. Thank you to all my patrons who support NameExplain on a monthly basis. NameExplain depends on small monthly donations from fans like you to help keep the channel running. Just a small amount of $2 a month helps in a huge way, grants you patron exclusive NameExplain extras, and gets your name here with all these awesome people. Thank you. Hello all, and thank you so much for reaching the end of the video. Stick around and check out another video, and subscribe to stay up to date on all things NameExplain. You can follow myself on Twitter at NameExplainYT. Follow me there and tweet the name of a baby boomer at me so I know you came from this message. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you all so much.